The agri-world of Veridia Prime was a jewel of emerald and azure, a planet so lush its very air tasted of life. Vast, cultivated plains of golden spire grain shimmered under a benevolent sun, their stalks swaying in rhythmic unison to the gentle winds. Dense, mist-wreathed forests of colossal pharopines and vibrant, bioluminescent moss clusters carpeted the continental uplifts. Rivers, fat and slow with nutrients, coiled like sapphire serpents through the verdant landscape, feeding inland seas that teemed with schools of iridescent fish. From orbit, it was a picture of imperial bounty, a world that existed solely to feed the endless appetites of the sector. To the 40 million souls who called it home, it was simply the world, eternal and generous. But in the deep green heart of that generosity, a single man had begun to notice a flaw in the tapestry, a single thread pulled loose. Kale was a senior botanist for the Veridian Agri-Combine, a man whose life was measured in growth cycles and soil pH levels. His domain was the Seraphax Plains, a 1,000-kilometer expanse of the planet's most productive spire grain fields. His first notation was a small one, an entry in a data slate log between rainfall metrics and fertilizer schedules. In Quadrant Gamma 7, a circular patch of grain, precisely 50 meters in diameter, had matured not into a healthy gold but a sickly, bruised purple. The stalks were brittle, their heads empty. It was not a known blight. His initial hypothesis pointed to a localized nutrient sink or a rogue soil pathogen. He ordered a quarantine and took samples. The root systems, when examined, were not rotted but strangely atrophied, as if the very vitality had been siphoned out from below. A week later, the head overseer of the avian observation post in the northern Sylvan Reaches sent a puzzled communiqué. The great flocks of silver-winged terns, whose migratory patterns were as predictable as the tide, had failed to arrive at their traditional breeding lagoons. Satellite telemetry showed them circling erratically over open ocean, their flight paths a chaotic scribble against the blue, before dispersing into confused, smaller groups. The report was filed under atmospheric anomalies and largely ignored. Kale read it, and the notation joined the purple blight in a growing, quiet corner of his mind. Then came the rain. It fell on the tin roof of his field station with a sound like ticking clocks, a soft, persistent drizzle that lasted 3 days. He caught a droplet on his tongue out of habit, an old botanist's trick to gauge mineral content. The clean, faintly sweet taste of Veridian rain was gone. In its place was a sharp, coppery tang, a metallic aftertaste that lingered on the palate like blood. He collected samples. The analysis showed trace elements of unfamiliar organic compounds, complex proteins that defied the planet's standard biochemical lexicon. They were not toxins, not in any conventional sense. They were inert, almost like fingerprints. He compiled his findings, the images of the purple blight, the aberrant migration data, the spectral analysis of the tainted rain, into a formal report for the Planetary Governor's Office of Ecological Stewardship. The response was swift and dismissive. Signed by a junior functionary, it cited seasonal fluctuation, solar cycle influence on magnetoreceptive fauna, and perfectly normal atmospheric leaching from the new orbital Habring construction. Kale was advised to focus on his yield quotas. The thread he saw was not just loose, those in charge were actively weaving over it. That evening, Kale walked the perimeter of the purple patch in Gamma 7. The setting sun painted the healthy fields in glorious fire, but the afflicted circle lay in a deep, cold shadow. He knelt, crumbling the dry soil between his fingers. It was not just dead. It felt empty, a hollow mimicry of earth. As he stood, a sudden, profound silence descended. The ever-present chorus of dusk insects, the distant calls of grazing herd beasts, the rustle of the wind through a billion stalks, All of it ceased for 3 long heartbeats. In that absolute quiet, Kale felt a chill that had nothing to do with the coming night. It was the feeling of being watched by something vast, patient, and utterly alien. A presence that saw the lush, vibrant world not as a home, but as a meal, and had just taken its first, almost imperceptible taste. The metallic taste never left the rain. Weeks after his report was dismissed, it became a planetary constant, a sharp, coppery prelude to every downpour that left a faint, rust-colored residue on leaves and windowsills. The vibrant jewel of Veridia Prime was beginning to tarnish at the edges, its brilliance dimming under a gathering, intangible stain. For Kale, the quiet dread that had taken root in the silent field now grew tendrils of urgent certainty. He was no longer a lone voice. A handful of others, a xenobiologist from the Central, Arboretum, a veteran game warden from the Northern Preserves, a concerned climatologist, had begun to notice their own anomalies. They formed an unofficial and quietly discouraged study group, pooling data in a secure sub-channel of the planetary VoxNet. Kale became their reluctant focal point, his initial observations the first pieces of a terrifying mosaic. The first undeniable public sign was the darkening of the night. It began at the poles, a deep, velvety blackness that swallowed the stars not with cloud, but with a profound absence of light. Within days, this stellar occlusion swept towards the equator. The great celestial tapestries, the spiraling arm of the galaxy, the familiar constellations used by sailors and settlers for generations, simply vanished. The nights became absolute, a blackness so complete it felt solid, oppressive. The moons, when they rose, were mere smudges of pallid light behind this interstellar veil. Planetary astronomers detected a vast, diffuse cloud of microscopic particulate matter drifting into the system's fringe, a cosmic shadow that drank starlight. Official bulletins called it a rare nebular interaction, a temporary astronomical curiosity. But no one's eyes believed the bulletins. The dark felt hungry. Life beneath this new, starless sky began to unravel. In the sylvan reaches, the massive, placid lumbergroks turned fractious, their lowing replaced with constant, agitated bellows. They broke through reinforced fences, trampling settlements not in stampede, but in a methodical, vicious rage, their eyes filmed with a milky, chitinous glaze. In the Arboretum, Dr. Leona documented explosive, cancerous growths in the native flora. Ferropines sprouted grotesque, bulbous galls that pulsed with a slow, sick rhythm. Luminescent mosses burned with a feverish, frantic brightness before withering into black, fibrous ash. The ecosystem was not dying. It was being rewritten, its normal patterns shattered and replaced with frantic, aggressive malformations. Kale led his small team to the outskirts of the Gamma-7 blight, which had tripled in size. The air there hummed with a low, insectal static. It was Warden Holt who found the first of the new things. In the crumbling soil at the blight's epicenter, he uncovered a nest. The insects within were unlike any Veridian species. They were the size of a man's thumb, their carapaces a glossy, alien black shot through with veins of iridescent purple. They had too many jointed legs, and their mandibles were complex, serrated tools that looked designed for dissection, not consumption. They were sluggish in the daylight but twitched with a disturbing, synchronized rhythm. Xenobiologist Wren sealed one in a stasis case. Under his portable microscanner, the horror deepened. The creature's biology was a nightmare of hyperefficiency. No digestive system, only a sac for liquid storage. A simplified neural structure that seemed to function as a receiver, not an independent brain, and chitin layered in a way that defied natural evolution, resembling engineered composite plating more than organic shell. Panic, once a simmering undercurrent, began to boil over. The constant, Starless night was a psychological weight on every citizen. The strange animal attacks made the news feeds no longer dismissible as isolated incidents. Whispers of xenotaint and systemic plague spread through the hab blocks and market squares faster than any official denial. The planetary governor finally announced a planetary biohazard review, but the mobilization had a desperate theatrical quality. Security forces in environment suits cordoned off the worst areas, but they looked like men trying to hold back a tide with broomsticks. Kale stood with his team on a ridge overlooking the expanding Gamma-7 zone. Below, under the oppressive blanket of the starless sky, the land itself seemed sick. The purple blight had spawned smaller satellite patches, a spreading rash. The air tasted of ozone and that ever-present metal. In the distance, the lights of Hive Seraph, the planetary capital, glittered defiantly, a bastion of normalcy. But Kale saw the truth in the darkness between those lights, in the unnatural silence of the surrounding fields. This was not a disaster approaching from beyond the atmosphere. It was a transformation flowering from within the very soil, a corruption using the planet's own life as its vector. The shadow was no longer falling. It had already seeped into the roots, and now it was rising, ready to consume the light from the ground up. The first spores of terror had taken root in the human heart, and the harvest was beginning. The planetary defense force mobilized with a clamor of righteous fury, a spectacle of imperial might meant to reassure a terrified populace. Columns of olive-drab chimeras rumbled from their depots, their tracks churning the rain-softened soil of the once peaceful plains. Sentinel walkers, their pilots eager for a clear enemy, stalked the perimeter of the expanding blight zones with searchlights piercing the unnatural dark. Infantry regiments in full kit took up defensive positions around key infrastructure, their lasguns pointed at the ominous silent forests. They expected an invasion force, dropships screaming through the atmosphere, xeno-warriors disembarking with shrieks and alien weaponry. They found nothing. The enemy was not arrayed against them in ranks. It was the very air they breathed, the ground beneath their boots. Patrols returned frustrated, reporting no contacts, only an eerie, deepening silence broken by the occasional distant scream of a mutated beast. The grand show of force was a pantomime against a disease, soldiers aiming at shadows while the infection spread through the planet's veins. Then, all communication with the outer system ceased. The orbital monitoring stations, the deep-range astropathic choir on Viridia's moon, the weekly supply haulers from neighboring sectors, their signals vanished into a wall of static so absolute it seemed physical. Attempts to re-establish contact yielded only a strange, pulsing return signal that bore no resemblance to human code, a rhythmic, organic pattern that slowly drove Vox operators mad with migraine headaches. The planet was isolated, wrapped in a shroud that blinded its eyes and deafened its ears. The starless sky was now a prison wall. It began as a vibration in the teeth, a subsonic resonance felt more than heard. Within hours, it deepened into a pervasive hum that vibrated up through the soles of boots, through the foundations of buildings, a frequency that seemed to emanate from the planet's very crust. It was a sound below hearing, a primal drumbeat that bypassed the ears to rattle the bones and churn the gut. Its effect on Viridia's wildlife was catastrophic and immediate. Herd beasts that had been merely agitated now tore themselves apart in frenzied stampedes, hurling themselves against cliffs or into rivers. Avian swarms, already disoriented, crashed into each other or the ground in feathery explosions. In the deep forests, the sound drove predators and prey alike into a state of hyper-aggressive, mindless rage. The natural order dissolved into a chaotic soup of tooth and claw, all harmony consumed by the relentless, grinding hum. Kale's team, holed up in a remote field station on the edge of the Sylvan Reaches, felt the hum through the floor plates. The lights flickered, powered by a failing generator. "It's in the rock," Warden Holt muttered, his hand pressed against the cold plascrete wall, feeling the tremor. Xenobiologist Wren was frantically studying the mutated insect, which had become violently active in its stasis case, throwing itself against the unbreakable walls in time with the subsonic pulses. "It's a signal," Wren whispered, his face pale. "A synchronization pulse. It's telling everything to change." Their discussion was shattered by the sound of splintering timber and a guttural, multi-throated bellow. From the tree line, a pack of lumberjacks emerged, but these were no longer the placid, six-legged beasts of burden. Their hides were sloughing off in patches, revealing glistening, raw muscle and plates of that same iridescent purple chitin. Their eyes were solid, milky orbs. Froth, tinged with the same coppery hue as the rain, dripped from jaws now lined with jagged, bony spurs. They moved with a terrifying, coordinated purpose, their massive heads low, charging the station. "Corrupted!" Holt yelled, snatching his heavy hunting rifle from the rack. The team scrambled. La's fire from Kale's sidearm seared the air, scoring a black line across the lead beast's shoulder. It did not falter. Holt's rifle boomed, and Agrox's knee exploded in a spray of ichor and bone shards. The creature fell, thrashing, but two others simply trampled over their fallen packmate without breaking stride. The station's reinforced door buckled under the first impact. With a scream of tearing metal, they fled out a rear service hatch as the front of the building collapsed in a roar of rending plasteel and bestial fury. Sprinting into the dense undergrowth, Kale glanced back. The Groks were not pursuing immediately. Instead, they were tearing into the fallen one, not eating but disassembling. Claws and teeth reduced the massive corpse to manageable chunks with horrifying efficiency. As Kale watched, a skittering tide of the thumb-sized black insects emerged from the soil, swarming over the meat, dissolving it into a slurry that seeped into the ground. The process was silent, methodical, and chillingly fast. Panting behind a moss-covered rock outcrop a kilometer away, the truth crystallized in Kale's mind with the clarity of ice. The governor's forces were looking for an external enemy. The people feared an invasion from the sky. But the Groks, the insects, the blighted plants, they were all native. The signal from the deep earth, the shadow in the sky, the metallic rain, they were not weapons of assault but catalysts. This was not an invasion. It was a conversion. The enemy was not coming. It was being built, forged from Veridia Prime's own biosphere, twisted and repurposed into a nightmarish reflection of itself. The planet was not being attacked. It was being digested from the inside out, its living essence harvested and remade into the vanguard of its own consumption. The shadow had not fallen from the sky. It had risen from the soil, and now it wore the face of home. The psychic scream began at dawn. In the fortified sanctuaries of the Astra Telepathica, the astropaths seated in their warded chambers convulsed as one. Their minds, perpetually stretched across the void, touching the Emperor's tarot and the whispers of distant souls, were severed. The connection did not fade. It was sheared, a psychic cable cut by a monomolecular edge. For a fleeting microsecond, each astropath perceived the thing that had severed it. Presence of such immense, hungry silence that it was less a mind than a gravitational well for thought, a devourer of light and soul. Then their bodies, unable to bear the backlash, erupted. Some simply ceased, hearts bursting like overripe fruit. Others tore at their own eyes, shrieking of a great devourer until their vocal cords shredded. The few who survived were left as empty husks, drooling and catatonic, their consciousnesses scoured clean. Across Veridia Prime, every sanctioned psyker, every latent witch, every untrained child with a flicker of talent suffered the same fate. The planet's psychic choir was silenced in a single bloody chord. The silence that followed was worse. It was not an absence of sound, but an absence of potential. For every human soul, a subtle background hum of connection, the faint sense of community, the unspoken understanding, the comforting, subconscious awareness of others, vanished. It left a cold, existential void, a profound, bone-deep dread. Descended, a weight that pressed on the chest and curdled hope in the gut. This was not fear of an enemy, but the terror of absolute, screaming loneliness in a suddenly dead and hostile universe. People stumbled in the streets, clutching their heads, weeping without knowing why. The will to resist, the spark of defiance, guttered under a blanket of suffocating hopelessness. The very air felt thick with despair. Above, the sky began to churn. The strange, star-occluding cloud coalesced, growing denser, taking on a sickly, yellowish-green hue. From this miasma, a gentle rain began to fall. It was not water. It was a sleet of microscopic spores, each one a perfect, organic vessel. They drifted on the wind, silent and inexorable. Where they landed, they hissed. Leaves pockmarked and dissolved. Paint blistered on hab blocks. Exposed flesh developed weeping, acid burns. The populace retreated indoors, but the spores seeped through ventilation ducts, under door seals. The atmosphere itself had become a slow, digestive fluid. Kale and his team witnessed it from a rocky bluff, their rebreathers filtering the worst of the acidic haze. They had been moving towards Hive Seraph, a desperate trek through a landscape growing more alien by the hour. The subsonic hum was a constant now, a vibration in the skull. The dread was a physical companion, making every step a struggle against a weight of utter futility. Kale fought it by focusing on the immediate, the rough texture of the rock under his hand, the labored sound of his breath in the filter, the determined, grim set of Warden Holt's jaw beside him. It was Holt who saw it first. He grabbed Kale's arm, his finger pointing skyward, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended their now constant state of fear. Kale looked up, through the toxic, greenish mist. The cloud was parting, not clearing but being displaced by something solid emerging from behind its veil. At first, it was just a darkness, a deeper blot against the sickly sky. Then, as the atmospheric filth swirled, the shape resolved. It was vast beyond vast. It made the mightiest Imperial battleship look like a child's toy. It was not crafted, it was grown. A bioship, a living asteroid of chitin and pulsating flesh, its surface a grotesque landscape of spires, vents, and membranous sails that billowed with cosmic winds. It was the color of old blood and bruise, a mottled purple-black, and it blotted out the sun. Then another appeared beside it, and another. They slid into view with a terrible, silent grace, an armada of nightmares. They filled the sky from horizon to horizon, a ceiling of living rock. The sparse, filtered light that penetrated the spore haze and the gaps between these leviathans was stained a deep, hellish crimson. Day was extinguished. In its place was a permanent, blood-red twilight, illuminated by the faint, bioluminescent glow that pulsed across the undersides of the Hive ships, a rhythmic, organic lighting that spoke of colossal heartbeats and slow, digestive processes. Kale sank to his knees, the strength leaving his legs. The data slate in his pack, filled with his careful observations of blights and mutations, felt absurd, a relic from a dead age of innocence. This was the source. This was the shadow given form. These were not ships in any human understanding. They were mouths, stomachs, wombs. They were the end of worlds. The faint, coppery taste in the rain, the mutated grox, the psychic scream, all of it was just the spittle dripping from these jaws before the bite. The Hive ships hung in the sky, silent and immobile, a judgment rendered. Below, in the bloody twilight, the final, fragile remnants of hope on Veridia Prime withered and died. The shadow was no longer a metaphor, a feeling, or a signal in the earth. It was a wall of flesh in the sky, and it was here to feed. The planet held its breath, a world awaiting the first, inevitable touch of teeth. The first impact was a thunderclap from a clear crimson sky. It struck the Seraphax Plains 50 kilometers north of Kale's position, a streak of organic meteorite trailing viscous fluid. The sound was not an explosion of munitions, but a wet, catastrophic crack like the planet's bones breaking. Then another and another, until the bloody twilight became a hellish symphony of descending doom. They fell not in disciplined volleys, but in a torrent, a squall of living artillery. These were the mycetic spores, the Vanguard's delivery system, teardrop-shaped pods of hardened chitin, each the size of an armored personnel carrier, screaming through the acid-thick atmosphere on plumes of jetting biogas. Kale watched, paralyzed, from the edge of a rocky defile. The spores struck the golden plains with the force of small asteroids, throwing up great gouts of soil and shattered spire grain. They did not explode. They hatched. Each impact crater pulsed, the spore's outer shell fracturing along spiraling seams with a sound like tearing. Cartilage. From the steaming, mucus-lined interiors, the horror emerged. It was not an army marching in ranks. It was a flood, a geyser of claw and chitin and gnashing teeth. First came the Ripper swarms, coiling masses of serpentine bodies, each no larger than a man's arm, all teeth and whipping tails. They poured from the spores in a silver-gray tide, a living liquid that flowed over the crater rims and immediately began to devour everything organic within reach, reducing grass, soil microbes, and their own birthing sacs to slurry in seconds. Behind them, with a skittering, clicking cacophony that drowned out the distant impacts, came the termagants. Gaunt, bipedal horrors with flesh-borer beetles writhing in the symbiotic weapons grafted to their arms. They scrambled over each other in mindless hunger, their lidless black eyes fixed on the horizon where the smoke of human habitation rose. Then the warriors emerged, towering over the smaller forms, their scything talons and bone swords. Gleaming dully in the hell light, they moved with a chilling, insectal purpose, their carapaces still slick with amniotic fluids. The Planetary Defense Force's response was immediate and utterly futile. From his vantage, Kale saw the flash of lascannon batteries from a fortified emplacement on the plains. A beam of coherent light speared a charging warrior, vaporizing its thorax. The creature fell, and the tide simply flowed over it, the Rippers pausing to strip its carcass in moments before surging onward. Heavy bolter teams, their guns roaring, scythed lines through the advancing gaunts. Hundreds fell, torn apart in bursts of ichor and chitin. It made no difference. For every creature that fell, 100 more spilled from the endless rain of spores. The air was now thick with the stench of ozone, spilled alien blood, and a sweet, nauseating pheromone reek. The PDF lines did not break. They were submerged. The Tyranid swarm hit the first defensive trenches not as an opposing force, but as a biological wave. Gaunts poured over the parapets, swarming the soldiers, not with tactical precision but with sheer, overwhelming volume. A man might blast one away, only to have 3 more latch onto his back. The Rippers flowed through gun ports and vision slits, a chewing flood that reduced crews to screaming, then silent bone fragments in their armored shells. The warriors strode through the chaos, their talons shearing through plasteel and flesh with equal ease, dismantling the hardpoints from within. There was no strategy to counter, no flank to turn, no command node to decapitate. The swarm was a single, distributed organism, its tactics reducible to a simple, horrific imperative: consume and advance. It learned only in the most brutal evolutionary sense. Where La's fire was concentrated, more spores fell just behind the lines, spawning creatures that attacked from the rear. Where the terrain channeled them into kill zones, the smaller gaunts simply piled upon their own. Dead, creating grisly ramps of corpses for the warriors to climb. The PDF's communications dissolved into screams and static, then silence, swallowed by the skittering, clicking roar of the swarm. Kale turned away, his stomach heaving. The plains were gone. In their place was a seething, monstrous carpet of alien life, a single, miles-wide entity chewing its way towards the population centers. The rain of spores continued unabated, a relentless downpour of doom that turned the crimson sky into a flickering storm of falling shadows. Each impact was another injection of ravenous life into the planet's withering body. This was not a battle. It was the first bite of a feeding, the insertion of countless microscopic teeth into the flesh of a world. The scale was incomprehensible, the speed apocalyptic. Veridia Prime's defenses, its soldiers, its courage, all of it was just the first layer of skin being peeled back, irrelevant before the sheer, mindless biological volume of the hunger that had fallen from the sky. The digestion had begun in earnest, and it started with the planet's guardians being dissolved in a tide of claws, consumed not by malice, but by the simple, voracious reflex of a single, starved beast the size of a fleet. The great Hive ships did not turn their attention to the screaming cities, the frantic void shield generators, or the crumbling bastions of mankind. These were mere morsels, distractions. The true feast, the planet's vital essence, lay elsewhere. While the human defenses were swamped under the chitinous tide on the plains, the Tyranid swarm executed a deeper, more fundamental strategy. It bypassed the arteries of civilization to sever the planet's very jugular. From the underbellies of the orbiting leviathans, new structures began to descend. They were not spores, but colossal, organic constructs, capillary towers. Each was a monstrous straw of living tissue, a kilometer wide at the base, sheathed in glistening, muculent membranes and braced by ossified ribs that spiraled into the bloody sky. They fell silently, with a terrible, deliberate grace, punching through the atmosphere not with fire, but with a wet, tearing sound that echoed across continents. Their targets were not landmasses, but the deep, life-giving waters. One such tower struck the planet's greatest feature, the cerulean abyss, a vast equatorial ocean that held 60% of Veridia's water. The impact sent tsunamis hundreds of meters high racing towards the coast, but that was a secondary effect. The primary function began immediately. The tower's tip, a vast, sphincter-like orifice, dilated open upon the ocean's surface. From its depths, a profound suction commenced, a gravitational pull that defied physics. The sea itself began to move, not in waves, but in a single, colossal vortex, a spiraling funnel of water that climbed impossibly up the tower's central bore. The sound was a deep, guttural slurping, the planet's blood being drawn through a cosmic straw. The tower pulsed rhythmically, its translucent sides distending with the passage of millions of gallons per second, pumping the stolen seas up into the waiting reservoirs of the Hive ships. Alongside the water went everything within it. Plankton, fish, great leviathans of the deep, entire ecosystems were vacuumed up and processed into bland, usable biomass. On land, the assault was equally systemic. The great equatorial rainforests, the planet's lungs, were not set aflame. They were inoculated. Spore clouds of a different kind settled over the canopy, not acidic but transformative. Where they touched, the vibrant greens and blues of Viridian flora withered and sloughed away within hours, replaced by a grotesque, pulsating carpet of purple and black fungal growth. Towering ferropines became skeletal frameworks for bulging, sac-like growths that dripped viscous digestive enzymes. The forest floor vanished under a spongy, living mat that absorbed fallen matter with audible, squelching haste. The process was one of instant, aggressive digestion, turning complex biomes into simple, absorbable nutrient sludge. Kale witnessed the macro-scale horror from a high ridge as his ragged group fled towards the distant hope of the starport of St. Lysander. The climate itself was unraveling. As the oceans were drained and the forests digested, the planet's energy balance was ripped asunder. In the region downwind of the cerulean abyss, they saw a storm of impossible ferocity, supercooled air, robbed of the ocean's thermal mass, clashing with the still warm land. A wall of black ice and lightning advanced across the plains, flash freezing everything in its path. Elsewhere, near the digested forests, the air grew still and lethally hot, the humidity spiking as the transpiration of millions of leaves ceased, creating localized dead zones where the atmosphere itself seemed to suffocate. The world was not being conquered. It was being dismantled, its fundamental. Life support systems harvested, causing rapid, cascading collapse. Their flight was a nightmare through a geography turned alien. The metallic rain had ceased, replaced by a new precipitation, a fine ashen dust that was the desiccated remains of digested matter falling from the processing vents high above. It coated everything in a gray, gritty film. The familiar sense of soil and vegetation were gone, overwritten by the sweet-rot stench of the hive and the ozone tang of atmospheric death. The constant, subsonic hum had deepened, becoming a physical pressure in the chest, the planet groaning as its vitality was siphoned away. Kale led them through a narrowing canyon, the rock walls showing strange, veined patterns of purple mineralization where capillary action had drawn up subterranean fluids now laced with alien enzymes. They found a stream, once a clear, rushing tributary. Now it ran thick and slow, a slurry of gray biofilm and dissolved organic matter, its banks lined with it. Stiff, coral-like growth that pulsed faintly. There was no choice but to cross. The substance clung to their boots like glue, and a faint, acidic tingle seeped through the soles. On the other side, they saw the evidence of the world's bleeding made plain. A vast, ancient lakebed lay before them, its basin cracked and dry, the waterline marks on the distant cliffs a stark monument to what had been. At its center, the cracked mud was already being overgrown by the creeping, digestive carpet, converting the barren lake floor into a fresh feeding ground. The message was inescapable. The Tyranids were not here for war. They were here for harvest. And they were draining the world's lifeblood first, ensuring that even if resistance lasted, the planet beneath it would be a dead, desiccated husk. The starport was their only hope, a slender thread leading off-world, but as they ran under the ever-watchful, fleshy spires in the sky, Kale knew they were not fleeing an enemy. They were insects, scrambling on the skin of a beast that had already begun to digest them. The canyon gave way to the vast, open basin of the dried lake, a cracked plain of gray mud stretching to a hazy, crimson horizon. The air here was still and thick, carrying a cloying, fungal sweetness that coated the back of the throat. Kale's group moved in a tight, silent cluster, their eyes scanning the unnatural terrain. The ground was not inert. A thin, glistening film covered the mud cracks, a biofilm that pulsed with a slow, capillary rhythm, visibly thickening as they watched. It was as if the earth itself was developing a new, living skin. In the distance, the fleshy stalks of capillary towers stood against the bloody sky like the ribs of a half-buried colossus, their sides distending rhythmically as they pumped the world's essence into the void. They reached what had once been the River Maris, a major waterway that fed the Great Plains. Its banks were now defined by grotesque, bulbous growths of spongy tissue like tumors on the landscape. The water did not flow. It oozed, a viscous, acidic sludge the color of tarnished brass, bubbling with pockets of gas that released a stench of rotting meat and chemical solvents. Where the sludge touched the biofilm along the banks, it was absorbed with a soft, sizzling sound, the two alien substances merging into a single digestive organ. Crossing was impossible. They turned north, following the river's course from a wary distance, their path taking them past the outskirts of one of Viridia's great silvopastures. The forest here was unrecognizable. The majestic canopy of broad-leafed verdant oaks was gone. In its place stood a nightmare garden of pulsating fungal grotesques. The trees had become skeletal frameworks, their bark slewed away, their wood transformed into a brittle, porous lattice upon which enormous, bladder-like growths hung. These sacs, veined with phosphorescent purple and sickly yellow, swelled and contracted like lungs, emitting a low, wet gurgle with each exhalation. The ground between the transformed trunks was a spongy, living carpet of interwoven mycelial strands, a foot thick in places, that yielded underfoot with a repulsive squelch. Bioluminescent nodules dotted this carpet, casting a wan, ghostly light that made the shadows between the fungal trees seem to writhe. The air thrummed with the constant, low-level activity of digestion, a sound like a million mouths chewing in unison. It was from this transformed forest that they heard the noise, a rising cacophony of panicked bellows and a higher, chittering skitter that set their teeth on edge. Holt motioned for silence, and they crept to the edge of a low rise overlooking a wide pasture that had once held a herd of docile, six-horned herdy beasts. The scene below was not a battle but a processing line. The great beasts, their hides matted and eyes rolling in terror, were trapped against a sheer rock face. Swarming over them, a living tide of silver and carapace was a ripper swarm. The creatures moved as a single, fluid entity flowing up the legs of the herdy beasts in seconds. Their effect was horrifyingly efficient. Where the rippers passed, flesh simply vanished. It was not torn away, it was liquefied, dissolved by a storm of microscopic, enzymatic teeth. The bellows of the beasts cut off with shocking suddenness, replaced by the wet, grating sound of bone being scoured clean. Within minutes, a herdy beast the size of a cargo truck was reduced to a gleaming, white skeleton, already crumbling as the rippers chewed through the marrow, and a spreading pool of pink-gray slurry. The slurry did not soak into the earth. The biofilm carpet, which had crept to the edges of the pasture, extended pseudopod-like tendrils into the nutrient-rich pool. The absorption was rapid and total. The slurry was drawn into the spongy mass, which darkened and thickened visibly, transmitting the stolen biomass through its network towards some central, unseen digestive node. The rippers, their bodies now distended with ingested matter, flowed off the bones and onto the next victim, leaving the clean, white skeleton to collapse into dust. The process repeated with mechanical, nightmarish precision. Life was not being killed. It was being disassembled into its constituent parts, cataloged and reclaimed. Kale watched, a cold numbness settling over him. This was the core truth, laid bare. The concept of a battlefield of two forces clashing over territory or ideology was a quaint human fiction. There was no conflict here, only consumption. The pasture was not a contested zone, it was a digestion pit. The rock face was not a defensive position, it was merely a convenient wall to corral biomass. The herdy beasts were not casualties, they were raw material. The Tyranids did not wage war, they fed. Every organism, every plant, every drop of water was simply another calorie to be ingested, its genetic information scanned for. Usefulness before its physical matter was broken down into a homogeneous, nutrient-rich paste to fuel the endless hunger of the Hive Fleet. The landscape itself was being converted into a planet-sized stomach, and they were insects crawling through its acidic folds. Turning away, Kale led his group on a wide arc around the pasture. The sight had stolen the last vestiges of hope from their hearts. There was no glory in outrunning this, no victory in escape. There was only the desperate, animal urge to not be there when the biofilm finally crept over your boots, when the skittering chitter grew loud behind you, when you were processed from a thinking being into slurry, and then into nothing but data and fuel for the great, silent devourer hanging in the sky. The starport of St. Lysander was a dream now, a fantasy of a world that no longer existed. They ran not towards salvation, but simply away from the spreading pit, through a world that was no longer their home, but a larder being. Methodically emptied, the starport of St. Lysander was not a city. It was a fever dream of desperation given concrete and steel form. From a distance, it resembled a wounded beast, its spires and landing gantries clawing at the bloody twilight, wreathed in the smoke of 1,000 fires. The great void shields, which should have shimmered with cool blue energy, flickered erratically, overloaded by the constant rain of acidic spores and the impact of living artillery. Kale's group stumbled from the corpse of the wilderness into its outer defensive perimeter, a nightmarish no-man's land of shattered rockcrete, melted plasteel, and churned earth that was more burial ground than battlefield. The air within the defensive ring was a palpable, choking miasma. It tasted of ozone, promethium fumes, and a deeper, organic foulness, the sweet rot of Tyranid digestion mixed with the copper tang of human blood. Spores drifted in visible, yellowish clouds, settling on everything. Soldiers and civilians alike wore rebreathers or crude cloth masks, their eyes wide above the filters, red raw from the chemical burn. The ground did not feel solid. It vibrated with a constant subterranean grinding, the sound of burrowing monsters undermining the foundations. Every few minutes, a section of trench or a fortified pillbox would simply collapse inward, disappearing into a sinkhole that instantly swarmed with skittering, multi-limbed horrors that boiled up from the dark. Human defenses were not merely crumbling. They were being erased by a total biological war. Artillery positions fired shell after shell into the seething tide beyond the walls, but the explosions were swallowed by the swarm, the craters filled in seconds by a living flood. Heavy bolter teams, their barrels glowing white-hot, created momentary gaps in the advancing gaunt broods, but the creatures behind simply clambered over the twitching mounds of their own dead, using them as ramps. Lasgun fire flickered across the line like frantic, dying lightning, each shot felling a creature, yet making no discernible difference to the advancing wall of chitin and teeth. But the true horror was the reclamation. Where a human soldier fell, his corpse did not lie still for long. Within moments, a skittering tide of rippers would emerge from cracks in the earth or simply detach from the larger swarm, flowing over the body. The process was horrifyingly swift, a wet, grating susurration, and in less than a minute, armor, flesh, and bone were reduced to a damp patch on the ground and a faint, dissipating steam. The fallen Tyranids were treated with the same efficiency. Biomass was biomass, and the swarm wasted nothing. The battlefield was not littered with the dead. It was being perpetually cleaned, digested on site, every scrap of organic matter harvested and fed back into the insatiable system. It made a mockery of sacrifice. To die here was not to become a memory or a monument. It was to become fuel for the very enemy you fought. Kale pushed through the chaotic river of refugees and exhausted soldiers flowing towards the inner bastion gates. The great walls of the starport hive rose before him, scarred by acid burns and the deep, parallel gouges of monstrous talons. Upon the battlements, he saw the last, grim tableau of human resistance. A squad of PDF troopers, their uniforms torn and stained, fought back-to-back against a knot of hormagaunts that had scaled the ramparts. La's blast seared the air. A gaunt's head vanished in a puff of ichor, but another lunged, its scything talons shearing through a trooper's arm. The man fell, screaming, and was dragged over the parapet by a dozen hooked limbs, his cries cut short. There was no time for grief, no pause for horror. The remaining troopers closed ranks, their faces masks of exhausted terror, firing until their power packs died. Then a new sound cut through the din of weapons fire and screams, a deep, resonant, chittering roar that vibrated. In the chest, from the swirling spore mists beyond the main gate, something large began to move. The disorganized swarms of gaunts and rippers, which had been pressing forward in a mindless, if overwhelming, tide, suddenly altered their behavior. They parted, flowing to the sides with a terrifying, synchronized fluidity. The human defenders, sensing the change, faltered, their fire slackening. The creatures that emerged from the gloom were a different order of being. A Tyranid warrior, twice the height of a man, its carapace thick and ornate, stalked forward on powerful limbs, a barbed strangler weapon twitching in its claws. Beside it came a hulking, quadrupedal beast, a ravena, its serpentine body coiled for a strike, a lamprey-like maw dripping corrosive saliva. But it was the third creature that held Kale's gaze and froze the blood in his veins. It was taller than the warrior, more slender, with a bulbous, elongated cranium that pulsed with a visible, sickly green bioluminescence. Zoanthrope. It floated above the ground, psychic energy crackling around it like a corona of malignant lightning. Where these larger creatures moved, the swarm ceased to be a mob. It became an organism. The gaunts no longer attacked individually. They moved in flanking packs, herding defenders into kill zones. The rippers flowed not to the nearest biomass, but to undermine specific structural points along the wall. The warriors' chittering roars seemed to direct the flow of the lesser creatures, while the zoanthrope's pulsing skull unleashed bolts of warp energy that melted rockcrete and vaporized entire squads, its presence casting a fresh wave of psychic dread that sapped the will of those nearby. Kale understood. These were the synapse creatures, the neural nodes of the hive mind. Their arrival meant the mindless hunger had been replaced by a terrifying, calculating intelligence. The swarm was no longer a wave. It was now a coordinated army, with tactics, specialization, and a cold, alien purpose. The ravena burrowed, disappearing into the ground only to erupt moments later within the inner courtyard, causing panic and redirecting defensive fire. The zoanthrope targeted command posts and heavy weapon emplacements with precise psychic blasts. The warrior led a spearhead of gaunts directly at the main gate's weakened hinge points. The last redoubt was not falling to claws alone. It was being dismantled by a perfect, biological weapon system. The air warped with psychic energy, the ground betrayed its defenders, every loss strengthened the enemy, and an invisible, collective mind now directed the slaughter with chilling efficiency. The hope that had flickered within the starport's walls, the hope of evacuation, of a last stand, of meaning in death, guttered and died under the gaze of those glowing synaptic nodes. The fight was over. What remained was merely processing, and the Hive had just sent its finest processors to oversee the final, efficient harvest of all. That remained of Viridia Prime's defiant children. The great adamantium-reinforced gates of the starport Hive shrieked like a dying beast, their final defiance a chorus of tearing metal and fracturing plasteel. It was not a single, catastrophic breach, but a systemic failure. The ravena had tunneled beneath the foundations, its corrosive secretions dissolving the bedrock. The warrior-led spearhead had hammered the weakened hinges with relentless, scything blows. The zoanthrope's psychic fury had warped the molecular bonds of the central locking mechanism. The gate did not fall inward. It disintegrated, collapsing into a pile of molten slag and twisted fragments, opening a yawning, 30-meter-wide maw into the heart of the last human refuge. There was no heroic last stand. The synapse creatures had seen to that. The moment the gate failed, the psychic dread emanating from the zoanthrope intensified into a crushing wave of pure synaptic override. For the defenders packed in the courtyard beyond, a final line of PDF troopers, arbitrators, and armed civilians, their courage did not break. It was simply deleted. Weapons fell from nerveless fingers as the will to lift them evaporated. Muscles locked or went slack. Some stood frozen, tears streaming from unblinking eyes. Others collapsed, curling into fetal balls, their minds retreating from the unbearable pressure of the hive mind's focused attention. The final, organized resistance ended not with a bang, but with a silent, psychic extinguishing of the human spirit. Then the tide poured in. It was not the mindless rush of before, but a horrifically efficient deluge. Different bioforms streamed through the breach, each a specialist in the harvest. Gaunts and hormagaunts flowed in first, not to kill, but to herd. They moved through the paralyzed crowds with swift, precise jabs of their talons, not eviscerating, but disabling, severing hamstrings, disarming, corralling the helpless masses into tight, shivering clusters. The air filled not with battle cries, but with a low, universal moan of terror, the sound of 10,000 souls realizing they were now inventory. Behind the herders came the processors. Larger, bulkier creatures with multiple, articulated limbs and dripping, syringe-like proboscises advanced upon the clustered humans. These were pyrovores and biovores, their forms dedicated not to combat, but to biological breakdown. A pyrovore would amble up to a group, its cavernous maw yawning open. A gout of viscous, digestive fluid, hotter than chemical flame, sprayed over the huddled forms. The effect was instantaneous and silent. Flesh, bone, cloth, and armor alike liquefied into a bubbling, nutrient-rich slurry that pooled on the flagstones. The pyrovore then lowered its proboscis into the pool, sucking the slurry up with a deep, resonant slurping that echoed off the courtyard walls. It was a living refinery, converting complex organisms into simple biomass on the spot. Elsewhere, biovores used grasping claws to pick up individual humans, living or dead, with chilling delicacy. They placed them into fleshy, sack-like organs on their backs, which sealed shut. A faint, grinding hum ensued, and moments later, a waste chute on the creature's underside expelled a compacted, desiccated brick of inert minerals and a trickle of neutral fluid, all that remained of a person's inorganic matter. The organic essence had been digested, absorbed. The courtyard became a sprawling, open-air abattoir, but one devoid of butchery's mess. The floor was left startlingly clean, save for the occasional stain of slurry quickly lapped up by skittering ripper swarms. The process was cold, methodical, and utterly devoid of malice. It was metabolic. Kale witnessed this from a precarious perch within a ventilation duct high on the courtyard's inner wall. He had been separated from his group in the final, panicked rush towards the inner bastions. The duct, a narrow shaft of grimy plasteel, was his only refuge. Through a cracked filter grate, he watched the end of his world with the detached clarity of shock. He saw Warden Holt, his rifle long gone, standing tall before an advancing pyrovore, shouting a final, unheard curse. The gout of digestive fluid took him full in the chest, and he dissolved into the steaming pool in the space of a heartbeat, his defiance meaningless, his identity erased as easily as a stain. Dr. Leona and Wren were herded together with a group of civilians. A biovore plucked them up one after another, stuffing them into its digestion sacs as if they were ripe fruit being harvested. The individuality of Veridia Prime's biosphere was being systematically erased. The genetic tapestry of a world, the unique helix of the spire grain, the distinct avian patterns of the silver-winged tern, the robust biology of the lumber grox, and the complex, sorrowful humanity of its people, was being consumed, scanned, and cataloged. Useful traits would be filed away in the genetic memory of the hive mind. The rest was broken down into fundamental proteins, amino acids, and carbohydrates. Through transparent, pulsating nutrient veins that now crawled along the walls and floors like grotesque ivy, the harvested biomass was pumped away. Kale could see it flowing, a thick, pinkish-gray slurry, moving with peristaltic pulses towards larger collection points. It streamed towards gaping, fleshy sumps that had erupted through the courtyard's stonework, leading down into the bowels of the conquered hive and ultimately up through capillary towers to the waiting fleet. The sound was the worst of it. The screams had faded, replaced by the industrial hum of digestion, the gurgle of fluids, the grind of compacting biomass, the wet suction of proboscises, the constant, skittering click-clack of chitin on stone. It was the sound of a world being processed. The hive's architecture, once a testament to human engineering, was being subsumed. Tyranid biostructures budded from the walls, gelatinous absorption pools, pulsing nutrient nodes, and spore chimneys that vented processed gases back into the tainted air. The starport was no longer a fortress. It was becoming a stomach, and Kale was trapped in its ducts, a forgotten crumb awaiting the final, meticulous cleaning. Below, the last cluster of humans was being liquefied. The pyrovore sucked up the final puddle, its body distending with the volume. The biovores, their sacks full, turned and lumbered back towards the breach to empty their harvest into the larger nutrient veins outside. The courtyard was empty, silent save for the hum. The first phase of the final consumption was complete. Every soul within the outer defenses had been accounted for, processed, and added to the stream. The hive mind's attention and its endless hunger now turned inward towards the deeper, darker places where the last scraps of life, like Kale, tried desperately not to breathe. The hum was inside his skull. It had replaced thought, a constant, subsonic vibration that resonated with the pulsing walls of the ventilation duct. Kale did not know how long he had crouched there, watching the courtyard below transform from a place of slaughter into a sterile, organic processing hall. The last human sounds had ceased hours ago. Now only the living machinery of the hive remained, the wet gurgle of nutrient veins, the sigh of spore chimneys, the occasional skitter of a ripper swarm performing some final, meticulous scouring. The air in the duct was thick, warm, and carried the same sweet-rot cloyness, now mixed with a sterile, almost chemical odor, the scent of a finished digestion. His rebreather had run out of filters long ago. Each breath tasted of enzymes and dissolution. He moved because stillness had become a louder scream than action. The duct was a tight metal intestine, but it led somewhere, and anywhere was better than this observation post overlooking a completed grave. He crawled, his hands and knees scraping against grime-slicked plasteel, following a faint, warm updraft that smelled of open sky. After an eternity of darkness punctuated by the faint, bioluminescent glow seeping through occasional grates, he saw a crack of light, not the hellish crimson of the spore haze, but a pale, phosphorescent green. He pushed against a warped access panel. It gave way with a shriek of tortured metal, and he tumbled out, falling a short distance onto a surface that was not metal, stone, or soil. It yielded. It was spongy, resilient, and faintly warm like living flesh. Kale pushed himself up, his hand sinking slightly into the surface. He stood on a vast, open plain, but it was a plain within a cathedral of nightmare. He was inside the starport's central landing field, but the world he knew was gone. The sky was not sky. High above, arching to an impossible zenith, were the fleshy, ribbed interior walls of a colossal capillary tower. The tower had not just landed nearby, it had consumed the spaceport, its hollow, organic gullet now enclosing it. The walls pulsed with a slow, rhythmic luminescence, veins of green and purple light throbbing like slowed heartbeats. The air shimmered with heat haze and drifting motes of biological dust. The ground was a single, continuous organism, a spongy, cerebral mass of interconnected tissue in shades of bruised purple, gray, and sickly yellow. It breathed. Subtle, wave-like contractions passed through it, a peristalsis on a planetary scale. In places, it bulged into gelatinous mounds or dipped into shallow, bubbling pools of clear, viscous fluid that steamed gently. There were no structures, no ships, no debris. All had been digested, absorbed, and incorporated. The very concept of waste did not exist here. Everything had been repurposed. The silence was absolute yet full. It was the silence of a vast, functioning body. The hum of circulation, the soft squelch of contracting tissues, the distant, watery rush of fluids. Through colossal pipes, the skittering of chitin was ever present, a baseline whisper of constant, industrious activity from unseen multitudes moving through hidden channels in the living floor. Kale stood, a lone, ragged figure in tattered environmental gear, upon this new, alien world. He was not attacked. No gaunt sprang from a hidden lair. No warrior descended upon him. He was irrelevant, a mote of dust in a finished room. The Hive's work here was complete. The planet's biomass had been harvested, its genetic library scanned, its physical matter converted and pumped into the fleet. This landscape was the aftermath, the empty, living husk of a process concluded. He was simply a leftover, a speck the vast digestive system had yet to notice. He took a step forward. The spongy ground absorbed the sound of his footfall. He took another, moving aimlessly across the breathing plain. A shimmer caught his eye, a movement across the surface 100 meters away. It looked like a tide, a thin, translucent wave of gelatinous film, maybe a centimeter deep, creeping across the living ground with a slow, inexorable patience. It was an acidic biofilm, a final, sweeping cleanser. Where it passed, the already smooth tissue of the ground became glazed, sterilized, and even more uniform. It made a soft, sizzling whisper as it moved, the sound of a gentle, final dissolution. Kale did not run. There was nowhere to run to. The wave was not fast, but it was omnidirectional, spreading to fill the vast, enclosed space. He watched it approach, a shimmering, oily curtain under the throbbing light of the capillary interior. It reached his boots. The effect was not violent. The biofilm simply flowed over them, adhering instantly. A sharp, cold, burning sensation shot through his feet as the potent enzymes penetrated the worn leather and synthetic fabric, contacting flesh. The pain was immense, a deep chemical dissolution, but it was strangely localized, almost clinical. He felt his skin and muscle liquefying, merging with the biofilm, which darkened slightly as it absorbed his biomass. He fell to his knees, the living ground soft beneath him. The biofilm crept up his legs, his torso, a rising, cool tide of annihilation. There was no struggle. The process was too absolute, too fundamental to resist. As it climbed his chest, he felt his heart stutter, its cells breaking down. As it covered his hands, he saw his fingers blur, then melt away into the shimmering gel. He looked up through the glowing, fleshy vault that had replaced the sky, and for a fleeting, infinite moment, his consciousness was not destroyed. It was accessed. A presence vast beyond comprehension, cold beyond the void, focused upon the flickering signal of his dying mind. It was not curiosity. It was an automatic, reflexive intake of data. In a nanosecond, the totality of Kale's life, the scent of spire grain on a Viridian morning, the metallic taste of the first tainted rain, the terror in Holt's eyes. The color of the sky before it died was siphoned, downloaded, and processed. His memories, his knowledge of Viridia's ecology, his fear, his love for his lost world, were broken into neural impulses, scanned for useful patterns, resistance behaviors, environmental adaptations, psychological weaknesses. The data was cataloged, compared against quintillions of other consumed experiences in the Hive Mind's infinite genetic memory. It was assessed, stripped of emotional context, and filed away as a series of biochemical and behavioral notations. Then it was discarded. The essence of Kale, the unique subjective consciousness that had observed the first blight and fought to understand it, was irrelevant. The data was retained. The self was not. His identity, his soul, was simply a redundant byproduct of organic computation, wiped clean like a used slate. The biofilm closed over his head. The last of his physical form dissolved into the nutrient stream. The synaptic flash of his life, S. Review ended in absolute silent negation. The biofilm wave passed, leaving the spongy ground smooth and glazed once more. No trace of the botanist remained. No bone, no scrap of cloth. His physical matter was already being drawn into the substrate, added to the homogenized whole. His experiences were now one with the hive's cold knowledge, a single, insignificant entry in the library of a devoured world. The hum continued. The light pulsed. The ground breathed. The final consumption was total. Kale's perspective, and with it, the last living witness to the world called Viridia Prime, ended not with a scream, but with the silent, efficient click of a file being closed in a dark and endless archive. Time, in the cosmic sense, is a patient and indifferent sculptor. It erodes mountains, fills seas with dust, and extinguishes stars with the same silent, relentless breath. For the star system once designated Viridia, time had passed. 3 standard centuries, a mere blink in the galactic. Had elapsed since the last psychic scream had echoed from the verdant third planet and been swallowed by the hungry dark. The great celestial clockwork had continued its turn, the system sun burning its steady, yellow-white heart out, oblivious to the absence of the jewel that had once graced its habitable zone. Into this ancient quiet glided a sliver of cold, human-made intelligence. It was an Imperial Survey probe, designation Vigil 77, a battered, bullet-shaped craft of pitted adamantium and fading auspex arrays. Its machine spirit, a simple heuristic algorithm, had been awakened from dormancy by pre-programmed celestial markers. Its mission was a routine census check, a bureaucratic tick on a forgotten ledger in a distant administratum vault. It coasted on momentum and minimal power, its sensors extending like the whiskers of a mechanical rodent, sampling the void. The probe's long-range augers painted the system's portrait. The gas giants still lumbered in their stately orbits, their asteroid belts unchanged. The sun's output registered within nominal parameters, but as it focused on the orbital path where Viridia Prime's gravitational signature should have been a firm, life-tinged pull, it found only a dissonance. The planet was not there, not as it had been catalogued. The data streamed to the machine spirit became a series of querying pulses, then a flat, confirmatory statement. Where a living world of emerald and azure had spun, a dead rock drifted. The probe adjusted its course on whispering thrusters, closing the distance for a high-resolution visual pass. The images it captured were desolate in their stark, mineral clarity. Viridia Prime was gone. In its place hung a husk, a skeletal remnant scoured of all that had given it life and name. Its atmosphere was a memory, stripped away to the last molecule, leaving the surface exposed to the naked, sterile vacuum. The once great oceans were empty basins, their beds cracked into global networks of canyons that spoke of catastrophic total desiccation. No polar ice gleamed. No clouds softened the harsh line of the Terminator. The planet's color was a uniform, lifeless gray, shot through with the raw, reddish-black of exposed mantle and the pale, bony white of continental shelves stripped of all sediment. The probe's sensors, designed to detect the faintest thermal or biochemical trace, registered nothing but the passive, residual heat of the sun-washed rock and the cold, deep space chill of the night side. All organic matter, every forest, every blade of spire grain, every microbe in the soil, every trace of the 40 million souls in their works had been excised. The process had been so thorough it had not left a stain. The great fungal gardens, the capillary towers, the pools of slurry, all the grotesque machinery of digestion was itself long gone, harvested or reabsorbed, leaving only the planet's mineral bones. The surface was scarred, but not by impact craters or volcanoes. The scars were vast, geometric patterns of trenches and smoothed basins, the fossilized impressions of colossal, organic structures that had once rooted into the crust to suck the world dry. They looked like the ghostly imprints of teeth on a cosmic carcass. The probe recorded it all. It logged the absolute zero atmospheric pressure, the null biosignature, the spectral analysis that showed only silicates, metals, and oxides. It mapped the barren topography, noting the absence of all fluvial and glacial features, the landscapes frozen in the final moment of total consumption. It was a perfect, sterile tomb. The data was compressed, packaged, and beamed towards the last known astropathic relay coordinates, a message in a bottle hurled into the interstellar deep. The chance of it ever being received was infinitesimal. The galaxy was vast, and the Imperium's attention was a flickering, scattered thing. Its duty discharged, the probe's machine spirit executed its next programmed function. With a final, minor course correction, it turned its blunt nose away from the dead world. Its thrusters glowed faintly, pushing it back onto its preordained survey path, a lonely sentinel resuming its endless, silent patrol. It gave the husk no further consideration. There was no lament in its circuits, no horror in its data banks. The planet was a mineralogical curiosity, a datum point in a map of cosmic resources now rendered worthless. The story of its ending, the metallic rain, the blood-red twilight, the final silent dissolution of a botanist named Kale, was not stored in its memory. That story had died with the last synapse of the last brain on Viridia Prime, consumed and discarded. The husk continued its silent orbit, a stark gray monument under the indifferent sun. The galaxy, immense and ancient, wheeled on. In the endless dark between the stars, driven by a hunger older than worlds, the Devourer moved, its countless hive ships a shadow within shadows, their course set for the next flicker of life, the next morsel of biomass. The feast at Viridia was a forgotten crumb. The appetite was infinite. The swarm was still hungry.